Hey, good morning, all. Tuesday, August 17th, and it's Politics Day here around the Common Good podcast. Good to have you all aboard. Doug Pagitt here in Minneapolis. Love to know where you are. So if you're following along on the live stream, want to let us know, or listening on the podcast, shoot us a message. Tell us where you're listening, what you're doing. I'm sitting down talking about politics today with Robb Ryerse, who's somewhere outside of Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Hey, Doug. Good to be back. Back from a 10-day trip to Ireland, and I got to tell you, there was
top of the morning to you. Then,
thank you. I have not had a Guinness yet today, but so many things that my wife and I, experienced during our 10 days of driving around the coast of Ireland and celebrating our 25th wedding anniversary. But I'll tell you, one of the things that we will probably always carry with us was that sense of what it felt like to be in a country that that wasn't trying to kill you. With an 80% vaccination rate,
really?
everyone wearing masks everywhere, having to show proof of being vaccinated before going into different restaurants or museums. Every place you go into, you give them your name and phone number for contact tracing in case someone turns up as positive. So many precautions, consistent signage across the board. We took a 15-mile boat ride out to Skellig Michael, which folks might know about. Apparently was where some of the Star Wars Last Jedi movie was filmed, and it's this island out in the Atlantic Ocean, 15 miles out, that was the home of a 7th century monastery, and you can visit it and then walk the 600 or so steps up through into where the monastery was. It was absolutely incredible experience.
Wow.
And there on the island that only holds a 7th century monastery, long abandoned, was COVID-19 signage, social distancing, hand sanitizer, attached to the stone, because they're taking this thing seriously. And so it was really wonderful to be somewhere for a little while that felt like, we're going to take this thing seriously as a government and as a people. And, my wife and I were talking with a bakery owner in little town of Dingle, Ireland. And it was a really wonderful experience. And he was telling us that he said, it doesn't matter what your politics are. This is bigger than that. And it was so fascinating to contrast that with where we're at in America, where COVID, masks, the vaccine, all of it has been completely politicized. And it feels like we're in a country that is, trying to kill us at times.
Well, how did it feel to be in a country where you had no freedoms then? Sure, they weren't trying to kill you, but you gave up all your freedoms to do anything that made life worth living. How did that feel?
Because we had
feel alive there.
Yeah, we had no ability to rent a car and drive all over the countryside wherever we wanted to go and do whatever we wanted to do. We actually did all of those things.
Being a little snarky, I mentioned yesterday that I had driven by a protest right up the street from my house where people were saying vaccines are temporary, loss of freedom is forever. So somehow, or viruses are temporary, lack of freedom is forever. So, I'm just assuming that some people's worldview is that places that are taking it seriously. Do you see that New Zealand is taking it seriously? One guy case contracted, and they shut the whole country down. Really I saw the headline that said New Zealand, goes on lockdown. I thought, oh boy, even New Zealand, which was this case of this is how you do it right, around COVID, was going to be shown as, it didn't last. Well, it's because one case was determined, and they're like, everyone freeze.
Yep.
Stop breathing, go in the house, and they took care of business.
Yep.
So they're just taking short stints, seriously, 3-5 days, and then kicking it back up. Yeah, well, it's clearly part of, but I guess in the United States, it's just good to be reminded that everything comes through multiple lenses, and one of those lenses is politics.
Yeah.
And yeah, this stuff has been politicized and going on for a long time. But that's good for us because we talk politics around here. So that
Exactly.
it's good to know that people are paying attention. And hey, good morning to you, Jim Eaton from Ventura, California, regular contributor here on this live stream. All right, Rob, lots of other things going on.
Mm,
It's August 17th,
mm,
summer, the dog days, some people like to refer to them, of summer in a non-election year. This is about as like wasteland of politics as you can get. Unless you're into politics, then you're thinking about all the things that are going to be coming into being in the next couple of months. But for a lot of people's minds, boy, they like to take a break from politics. They don't want to think about it. They want to set it aside for a while. We get that, but around here we like to work in the off seasons as well. And a couple of things have come up for our conversation about this. Let's start with Afghanistan, and that feels like it's changing every day. We just did a long bit on it yesterday here on this podcast, and since then it changed. President Biden came out and gave a speech that I saw most of. I think I've watched it in pieces as it's shown up at other places, but I think I've caught all of it. And he makes this strong point about why we're not staying in Afghanistan, of which I have full agreement with, but doesn't really get into the execution of how we're not staying in Afghanistan. And it feels like this is one of those flashes of a lack of competency in execution. And I think it has to do with just always the difficulty of the handoff between the military and the rest of society. That
mm.
once again, you can listen to yesterday's recording if you want to hear more of my rant about all that. But the military just, we don't have good solutions for filling the gap. And I know that a lot of people are saying we need to get out the people that supported the U.S. military over these 20 years. Here's why I think we need to be careful about that. And I think that Biden's going to be in a really tough place to ever fulfill what some people want around that is. You're not just going to remove the translator, because the translator doesn't want to leave his or her family. And you're not just going to take out the translator and their spouse, or the translator, their spouse and their kids. That you have a society that's built around a familial system where it's cousins and aunties and uncles and all these other people that are also part of the family that are going to be threatened. So while there's 10,000 translators, that represents hundreds of thousands of people. Like, this is what happens when the US goes in and uses people in country to fight against or an insurgent force, and then they're going to leave, is that the ramifications of that they're wide and they're deep. So I think sometimes we get this idea that's a little Pollyannish that, hey, go get the translator that helped us and get the translator out. But it's going to mean that person plus 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 12 others that are also going to come out. And that becomes an incredibly difficult thing to manage and process to pull apart. So I think this is just, it is riddled with failure. Even if it was, I'm not making any excuses for how poorly they planned and executed this initial getting people out of the country. But I think for us to be, like, satisfied, that's never going to happen. We are the people who really, a lot of us that have deep empathy for those who supported the U.S. as citizens and worked for our military purposes in that country, we're not going to be able to fulfill all those promises that were made. It's just not possible.
Yeah. It's just it's a heartbreaking situation on so many levels. And I think, from a political standpoint, it's interesting to consider, not just the execution of how things are, of how the withdrawal is happening, how, our disengagement in Afghanistan is taking place, and the effectiveness of that. But then also, when you layer on top of that the optics of what it looks like, what the images are, what scenes were being shown, and even if we're able to kind of recover, get our footing, realize, oh man, we might have botched this at the beginning, and get some much better sense of how to handle, this withdrawal, and how to handle, refugees from Afghanistan, and getting diplomats out and journalists and all of that kind of stuff. 2-3 days from now, if we've got that all figured out and the logistics are working perfectly, the lasting images are going to be of those 650 people crammed into an airplane, the crowds of people chasing the airplane as it goes down the runway, the horrific pictures of people falling to their deaths after clinging to
trying to hang onto an airplane that's taking off. Yeah,
it's just though the chaos of that, I think, is going to be the lasting image. And from a political point of view, and I hate to, we I think it's a mistake to look at everything purely through the lens of politics, but the reality is that we need to, and I think this is really, really politically damaging to President Biden. And I think this is one of those things that, whether rightfully or not, and I would probably argue in many cases not, this is, regardless of what has happened, what was supposed to happen, who negotiated what agreements were made, this cluster of chaos that is happening right now is the lasting image that's going to stick, and it's going to stick to him, and it's going to be, I think, a really difficult thing to maneuver politically for him. It's going to look like, man, he botched Afghanistan. Whether that's true or not, that's gonna stick.
I think that's true. And at the same time, people have really short memories, and 6 months from now, whether anyone is still remembering with the emotional level about this difficulty, or if it's just going to be, oh yeah, Afghanistan was a mess. And here's why I think it may have political, it'll get attached to him, but it might not have a lot of consequence to it. It'll become one of the features of, the Biden presidential automobile, but it's not what anyone's going to decide if they're going to, re-up that lease or not.
Yeah.
Feature. I think they're just going to forget about it like we do so many other things. And the degree to which people haven't cared about Afghanistan for 20 years, I don't know that they're going to rally up to all of a sudden have this huge outcry about what we owe. Maybe we should, maybe not, but I just think your average person's going to set this aside by the time we get down there. When they think about Afghanistan from beginning to end, it's going to be like every president was bad on Afghanistan.
Yeah. Do you worry, though, that the brand that is developing for Joe Biden is one of best intentions and complete inability to pull it off?
Well, that's where I think the problem will come in, is if competency around execution of things,
right.
And if this becomes a tile in a mosaic that creates an image of competency or incompetency, that's where it's a big deal. So that's what I think can be solved. There's almost a sense in which if Afghanistan is an outlier of competency, like, well, that was horrible, can't let that happen again. And there are a lot of reasons, but here's other things that were not. That actually, I think, then becomes something that's manageable. And how they're going to handle this in the last 24 hours and the next 72 hours probably has a lot to do with that. Literally what they do. I thought it was great that he came out and just owned it. I thought he was Pollyannish again about, hey, we planned for every contingency, but this all happens rather quickly. And I get what they're doing. Like, not to be as apologist, but they didn't want to pull out all American staff and all American interests when our military pulled out. They wanted to believe, and send the message that Afghanistan was a legitimate nation and we can have relationships there and we're not going to pull all of our people out. So they weren't going to be planning to evacuate everyone at the same time. Like, had they done that, had they planned for, okay, within 5 days of the pullout, the final days of the pullout, we're going to remove all of the translators, all of our staff from embassies, all of the contractors. They're all coming out. And then the Taliban takes over. You know what people would have said? Well, they took over because you pulled everyone out. Like, this is why the military
No-win.
approach,
Yeah.
the military approach everywhere is just bad, because you can't solve for it. You create this craziness and context. You can't solve for it. So can you imagine what we'd be talking about if it was, hey, they rushed a bunch of people out and they were bringing out 3,000 people a day for 10 days or something like that? Man, people would have said that's what created the problem. So when Biden says, hey, we thought this would go slower, that's sort of a slow attrition of the people, that's sort of what they were hoping for, knowing maybe that wasn't going to happen. And here's the thing that I think could be Biden's real Achilles heel on this. He's the empathy president. So people have said, like, wow, this guy's really empathic and he really cares. He doesn't seem to be showing any empathy for the people of Afghanistan. I don't know what goes on, what's in his backstory, but he has been sort of like, from way back in 2001 and as the vice president as well, and then a campaign trail, like, not really. He's talking about the United States relationship to human rights. He's talking about our role in Afghanistan. He's not really ever here. I never hear him talk about the plight of the people, other than the United States should be supporting human rights.
Right.
But it's not like, hey, there's these translators and these kids and this thing is going to be happening, and these beauty salons are being shut down and the people who ran them are being gathered up by the Taliban and bad things are happening. He's not going into those spaces where a lot of commentators and a lot of people like the rest of us are talking about the human toll. This is the one place where he's acting more like a cold-hearted politician and president, and I'm not sure if that's gonna come across well to people, that his administration seemingly, not just incompetence, but almost has a "that's not our problem" sort of attitude to it. So I don't know. That could be.
This is such a complicated situation, and it's once again one of those things, and I rail about this at times, when it comes to things like Supreme Court justices being nominated, where 10 minutes after someone gets nominated to the Supreme Court, we all have to be experts on that person whose name we did not know 10 minutes beforehand. It's just this ridiculousness, this rush to instant takes on things, and now you spend any time on Twitter, and I've spent a lot less time on Facebook, so I don't know if it's this way there, but I imagine it is. But everybody and their uncle is an expert on Afghan, Middle East, and Asian and policy, and it's just like, come on, can we not take a minute and take a minute and take a breath here and recognize that this is a tremendously complicated situation. That we probably bungled it from the beginning, and are like, this conclusion was inevitable. And instead of kind of pausing and reflecting on, okay, what does this mean for how we engage in the future? Do we, I think, Doug, you and I would probably be in strong agreement that, this myth of redemptive violence that is just so a part of the American ethos, that if we are hurt, that if we are harmed, that the way we ought to respond to that is with shock and awe, with overwhelming response of violence, that's the way to fix situations. Like, no, it's not. And what happened to the United States on 9/11 is absolutely terrible. Does that mean we should invade another country? And
two of them.
Two of them. Exactly. And there's, so I would love to see some kind of reflection on that, some kind of reflection on, oh my goodness, how many lives, how many resources, how much money, how much damage to the planet have we done by engaging in Afghanistan for the last 20 years? That, like, the toll of this is just never going to be is never
Right.
going to be fully appreciated.
Yeah.
And then you layer on top of that, like, just the daily images we're seeing now of people in desperate situations, and our kind of wrestling with, should we help, how can we help, is it our
Yeah.
responsibility to help? Like, all of these things just show it is so so complicated, and requires us to, I think, to set aside some of our desire to see who's going to score the political points and who's going to benefit from this, and and kind of recognize that, like, there's something much bigger that's happening here that we need to fully
Yeah.
appreciate. And 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 I really think that, the people that are trying to politicize this, and I think, looking squarely at the Republicans over this, um like, I what I see, from a political standpoint, is a group of people who advocated for this very thing, seeing it being bungled, and now, are vulture circling
Sure.
and
Sure.
saying this is our opportunity to strike and to score some political points, and which is exactly the wrong thing that should be happening at this point. Whatever happened to politics ends at the nation's borders,
Yeah.
like, you know
Well,
it,
and look, I get that. I get the politics ends at the nation's borders argument. That's been one of the tropes, though, that has allowed
Mhm.
us
Oh,
to
sure.
have a militarization and an international policy that goes unquestioned. Is
Yeah.
that every
Oh,
time something's happening overseas, everybody's like, "Hey, we got to rally around the flag."
right.
No counter voices. So the little
Right.
fringy counter voices. So I'm
Yeah.
not
So,
totally opposed
yeah.
to.
Let me just
I
say,
hear you.
I personally completely agree with you, but it's the Republicans who are now criticizing Joe
Yeah,
Biden
fair enough.
that have been the advocates for the policy,
Yeah,
that politics ends at the nation's borders. And now, like, I'm in pointing that out, I'm trying to point out their own
the
hypocrisy.
hypocrisy. Yeah, yeah, that's good. Yeah, good point. And Mike Dufresne makes a nice point as well that this actually goes back to Reagan funding the freedom fighters
Mhm.
in Afghanistan and Bush with the Saudis and all the rest. So this Afghanistan circumstance and situation, I mean, it goes way back to that Billy Joel song, like "We Didn't Start the Fire," with Soviets in Afghanistan. If you go way back into the '80s, like Reagan had to respond to the fact that the Soviets were supporting, the Afghan government, and so this is a thing that we have been poorly involved in Afghanistan and for so long. Biden makes a point about it being 20 years, but it's actually been an entire lifetime.
Yeah.
And there was just no way to get out of this, and probably no way for even the evacuations or the leaving or the pulling out to go well. Uh,
Mhm.
I, I know people are saying, like, "Hey, this all could have been handled better." Uh, sure, of course, yes, but measurably better? Do we really think? Like, was there not going to be another set of images, another set of stories coming out about how we turned our back on people I don't know. I think
Mhm.
that this was destined to not have a good conclusion from the vantage point of people who care about the human suffering. It was destined to be a problem to begin with. And so Biden is going to put some blame on Trump, and Trump is going to blame Obama, and Obama is going to blame Bush, and Bush is going to blame Clinton, and the fact that Madeleine Albright was all for the Taliban at one point back in 1997, and here we go, right? But that's the situation we have. So this re-navigating our relationship there, it's not it was never going to be
Yeah.
a decent thing, it seems to me. Hey, Jimmy, this is a great comment. He says, "Hey, as soon as I think I'm interpreting this right, as soon as Biden comes across as someone saying he's an incompetent president, that Trump is going to come out and say, 'I was the most incompetent president.'" His competition gene is going to step in and he's going to say, "No, I was the greatest incompetent president ever. No one was
Yeah.
ever more incompetent than me." All right, that takes us to the
People are saying, we
the
are the
orange
people that
faced,
are saying that.
yeah, the twice impeached failed presidential reelection candidate Donald Trump. Here's the thing that struck me this last week: how little of Donald Trump is in the news and in my news feed. There was a while where, man, going through the Apple News site or other ones, everything I was seeing had to do with Trump. Like it was just all over. And for some reason, that has really slowed down and diminished. And it feels more like what I thought it would be like when he was out of office, and it didn't seem that way in April and May and June and July. But it feels like something has turned. I don't, look, the guy can come back like a bad summer rash. There's no doubt about that. Um, but it feels like I feel like his influence is waning. Do you think that's true? Do you think there's a waning nature, and that the people who are supporting him are even becoming more fringy inside the people who support your run of the mill Republican or even support Donald Trump as the president?
Yeah, and maybe part of the reason why Trump is receding from from your newsfeed and whatnot is because we passed reinstatement day with without Donald Trump being
When was
reinstated.
that?
I mean,
When was
it
reinstatement
was
day?
supposed to be Friday. It was supposed to be
Last
this past
Friday.
Friday.
Oh, I
Yeah, it
missed
was
it.
supposed to be the day that Donald Trump would return to his rightful place as a dear leader of our country, and it didn't happen. And so I don't know. I tend to think that this is more like the summer rash that you just mentioned
Okay.
than a a
Right.
permanent situation. I think what we're going to see here with Trump is you know kind of picking his spots and his opportunities. And in fact, I think even this Afghanistan situation, is one of those where he's certainly it's brought him back into the spotlight where he was arguing for all of this, but and maybe in some negative ways, because clearly the Republican Party is trying to scrub a bit of what was taking place
Yeah.
during the Trump administration. And this article that's out now about how the Republican National Committee has removed a page from their website, which was praising Donald Trump for making an agreement with the Taliban that included this withdrawal that I think he wanted to happen by May, and has been critical of Joe Biden that it hadn't happened yet. Um, and and now that's gone. And this is, when I mentioned that kind of cynical political thing of trying to score points, this is what I'm talking about. Like, this is the cravenness of the
Yeah.
politics that says, oh well, we kind of set the stage for this. We negotiated this. We tied your hands with this, and now we're gonna, now that it's going badly, we're going to criticize you for it. We're going to try to pin it on you. If it had gone well, they would have been crowing about how this was everything that Trump had planned and he had put into
That's right.
place. And so like that kind of political cynicism is there. What's so interesting to me about this though is and honestly I gotta say uh, I'm not as like up to speed, I guess, on this Taliban agreement. I like with everything else that was happening in the Trump administration. This was one that, frankly, had was not on my radar.
Oh,
Um,
did
and
did you know that he wanted to invite them to be at Camp David on September 11th, 2020? That was his plan. He had invited them in that phone call to come and to be in the United States and to stand and shake hands at Camp David on the day of the 19th anniversary of September 11th to declare that we've now solved Afghanistan by this historic negotiation with the Taliban. That was, they did everything except have the Taliban come to the United States for a presidential visit at the Camp David Retreat Center.
yeah, so I guess I'm left with a couple of questions.
That
One
guy.
is, yeah, one is, you know, this happening, why were we negotiating with the Taliban instead of, working with, the duly elected, Afghani government? And I'm sure there's answers to that. It's just one of those weird. It just feels like, well, this is
And
this.
it's
It
because the
feels really
Taliban had functional control of more than 60% of the country.
yeah,
Basically, the Afghan government was only in certain population
yeah,
centers, and the Taliban was, and Mike Pompeo negotiated and had a perspective that it's really the Taliban who has the cultural sway in the country. And that's really what many people believe undercut the government from
yeah,
being able to function. That the citizens were like, we don't trust the government. We don't know who they are. We know the Taliban. They're in our lives. They've been around for 40 years. We know that organization and how they function. And then when the United States started to um, use them as their primary conversation point, I mean, there was, this really goes back.
yeah. Well,
Probably the biggest political impact of all of this, and praise all goodness for this. Mike Pompeo will never be the president of the United States because he will be tagged with all of those pictures standing in Afghanistan with the Taliban, and the GOP can take this off their website as a historic accomplishment of Donald Trump. But Mike Pompeo was the hand that reached out and connected to the Taliban, and that is going to be the end of that, as they
yeah.
say.
The other question I have is, why is Joe Biden, um, tied by this agreement? You know what? Like it why did this have to happen? Could this not have been renegotiated? Could this not have been, granted it did happen later than originally planned. It was supposed to happen in May. It didn't happen until August.
Well, they agreed on it. I mean, they both had the same perspective. The U.S. should be out of Afghanistan, and by the time Trump had worked it down to 2,500 or 3,500 forces left in Afghanistan when Biden came in, the only thing he could do would be to send 10 or 20,000 more back there. And Biden had said, "I'm doing the opposite of that. I also want them all out." So he may not have wanted the deal with the Taliban, but he did want the U.S. forces out. And so at that point, could he unravel a legal agreement between the United States and the Taliban? I don't know that the president
Yeah,
had the authority to do that. But instead of this all being the thing that we're able to talk about now, it's, as you say, the images in your mind of people on runways holding onto airplanes and begging to get out, and showing how terrified they are of the reality of the Taliban. That Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo, and maybe even those in the Biden administration, I don't know, were not afraid of. They didn't see that the Taliban running Afghanistan was going to put this country or even Afghanistan apparently in such harm's way. And they're going to be proven wrong for that, I think. And that's going to be the end of the people who tag their uh, political wagon to that horse.
you hope so. You hope so. And if if people's memories are long enough, that will be the key question that exists there.
I saw some posts the other day that from some people I know and think highly of, but they were saying, hey, if evangelicals keep taking over political power in the United States, is what we're seeing in Afghanistan just a prelude to what we're going to see in the United States? And so I don't know if you get what they're getting at there. What I'm saying is that religious fundamentalists like this, and comparing Christian fundamentalists or Christian evangelicals to the Taliban, I think, is a thousand steps too far, and just an inaccurate comparison that's of no value at all. I don't think we should be looking at Afghanistan and being worried about, that if the Matt Gaetzes of the world or Mike Pompeos of the world or Marjorie Taylor Greenes or Donald Trump's, that somehow this is going to turn into a fundamentalist society where it's as if we're living under Taliban rule. But that's the level to which people are fearful of politics in this country, and any more than the people who think that if you have to have a mask mandate in a school, that you've lost all your freedoms. There's no reason to be an American any longer. I mean, the catastrophic thinking that can go on sometimes in our cultural and politics is really amazing, really an amazing thing. But I'll tell you somebody who did have a catastrophic view of the world, and that's my pillow guy. Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, technically, he is my pillow guy because I do own, but no longer sleep on a my pillow. But not because Michael Lindell made it, just because I found a better pillow.
Mm.
He's a Minnesota fella, so I feel a real deep connection to him, Minneapolis guy. And if you don't know who Lindell is, he's the one who owns the company My Pillow, and is probably the greatest booster of Donald Trump and the greatest booster of the election was stolen that you can find. And Rob, I thought you had a really good insight on this. That what we're seeing going on through the life and lens of
Yeah,
Mike Lindell is actually an indicator of something that looks rather familiar in
yeah,
right wing extremist politics that we see in other parts of our
yeah,
world.
yeah, yeah. So I grew up in um, a, a a version of fundamentalism that you know now we often, and Doug, you just did this, kind of equate fundamentalists and evangelicals. It's like very easy to put those groups together. I grew up in a type of fundamentalism, a separatist type of fundamentalism that we did not identify as evangelical because evangelicals were seen as compromisers. And uh, and I often joke, that I grew up in a Baptist denomination up north where we weren't allowed to have anything to do with the Southern Baptists because Southern Baptists are too liberal. That just, to kind of just put on the spectrum of where we were, and we were, even in our circles, we were a bit of a moderate fundamentalist denomination. They're independent, fundamental Baptists that, were far to the right of us. Um, and and so, you know, growing up in that, I know a bit about the history of fundamentalism, and what was known in the early 1900s as the fundamentalist modernist controversy, the birth of evangelicalism that came as a result of that, the different approaches of how to respond to theological liberalism. The fundamentalists had this kind of separatist approach where we pull out and we have nothing to do with these theological liberals. And then there were others who like, well, let's kind of engage and see if this thing can be reformed. And these different approaches that have given birth to now where we've got fundamentalism, and then we've got evangelicalism, and all the different stripes. But one of the things that happened historically was as these groups began to separate, they would have reason to no longer be in relationship, no longer be in fellowship, no longer work together with people. It began with a separation from the the theological liberals,
Right.
those who were denying the deity of Jesus or the virgin birth and those kinds of things. It was this very major, in their view, theological positions that would cause this separation to take place. But what happened over time is those things that they that need to keep separating, you know, got turned more and more and more and more on each other, to the point where you end up with these very fractured micro groups that have separated from each other, not over the big stuff but over these very minor things. And so you end up with all of these different fractured approaches where, like, that tendency to separate was turned on each other. That fundamentalism got turned on other fundamentalists. And this is something, we can, it happened in the church in America. What I'm beginning to observe is that same kind of fracturing is happening in the very far extreme kind of MAGA, um,
Right.
conspiracy theory wing of the Republican Party, is personified by Mike Lindell, who had this symposium, this cyber symposium, where they were going to figure out all the ways that the election was hacked, and they had all of these cybersecurity experts, and then they got hacked apparently, which was, if you were going to write the script, I think we all would have predicted that this cybersecurity cyber symposium is going to get hacked and they're going to cry foul. Like, that was, you could see that one coming from a long way out. Mike Lindell was on, I think,
OAN. What?
OAN.
The One America Network, the
One
alternative
American
to Fox
Network,
News.
complaining about Fox News.
Yeah.
That the Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, Trucker Carlson, as he calls him, Trucker Carlson. You know, these folks who, Mike Lindell thinks should be supportive of his positions, aren't covering his cyber symposium the way that they need to. They're not talking about the election in the way that they need to. They've moved on, and what we're seeing, I think, is the beginning of this kind of fracturing where there's this purity of like, I'm pure and anybody else who's not, like, they're not pure enough. Like listen, Mike Lindell and Sean Hannity are, like, I mean, there's a paper's width bit of difference between them.
They're like
But
hand
now,
and fingerless gloves. There's a little separation right at the end of the finger, but they're pretty well hand
they're
and
there.
fingerless gloves.
But now they're, Lindell's turning on Hannity because, these very minor things of like what stories get covered on his show. And I think we're going to see that this conspiracy theory mentality, in the same way that separation mentality took place in theological and ecclesiological fundamentalism, I think this kind of conspiracy theory mentality is going to take place, is going to take hold, and is going to get turned on on people who should be allies. And I think it's going to cause a really severe fracturing on the far right that is gonna push some people to even further extremism. But here's the concern I have. My hope is that it doesn't create this perception that, well, Fox News is reasonable, moderate in some way. And, like it's all a matter of like where the perspective is. If we've shifted it so far this way that they appear moderate, like then we're in big trouble. So it's
that's that's the slow drift that can be worrying. You think about how Elvis Presley in 1957 couldn't be shown below the waist dancing on television, and we've now incorporated all that. So people talk about this incorporation of things that used to be taboo. It can work the other way too, not just toward more openness and libertine expression. It can go the other way, that things that used to seem so extreme on the fundamentalist side just get incorporated in because a new edge of extremism is formed. I think that is actually what we're seeing. Trump had a lot to do with that and continues to. And, Trump was going after Fox News even before Lindell. Like, he was saying to people, stop watching Fox News, start listening to OAN. He had his press secretary invite these people from these little internet-like radio and TV networks like ours into the White House press office to give them legitimacy. And he's like, we're going to build an entire alternative network with OAN and a couple of those other ones. So if you're unfamiliar with One America Network, OAN, you just need to know that that's out there and that they have as many people who support Trump listening to them as Fox News has people who support Trump listening to them. Doesn't have as many people as Fox News has, but of the true Trumpers, they really have more of them and much greater influence. It's bonkers. And I think you're onto something else here, Rob, and that is fundamentalism is not predominantly about how offbeat your belief is. We tend to think that, well, what do you mean by fundamentalist is somebody who thinks something really extreme. Mm-hmm. Fundamentalism is better understood as an extreme way of thinking about anything you believe. Yes. Yes. So if you believe something and you make that mandatory, that's fundamentalism. Yes. Not if what you believe is wackadoodle by a certain percentage of the population. That has nothing to do with it. So, your illustration was great, because what people are getting at when they this fundamentalist struggle is they're like, this thing that I'm talking about, it is so important. How can you not be talking about it? Like, look, if I believed what Mike Lindell says he believes, and I trust him that he believes this, that the election was stolen by this set of by these people interfering in these ways, if the things he's describing had happened, and I believe those things had happened, I don't know, I think I would be, feeling like, my gosh, this is a major, major problem. So what he's done and what people like him have done is they've elevated to an unchallengeable level the truth of this. So
Hmm.
we all have to watch our fundamentalism tendencies and don't tell ourselves that we think mainstream so we're not fundamentalists, because it's not what you believe, it's
Yes.
how you hold those beliefs.
Yes. Yes. Fundamentalism, and the people that have, and if I have any kind of following, it's, people have heard me say this, many times over the last 15 years. Fundamentalism is an attitude. It's not a set of beliefs.
That's great.
And one of the, there's a lot happening right now in terms of, kind of looking at deconstruction, and there's, lots of interesting things that are happening in the world of kind of ex evangelicals in terms of deconstruction, and there's different controversies that are taking place right now. uh, One of the things that I've seen is people kind of deconstruct their faith, and this happens both in theologically in church life, and it happens in politics as people move from one group to another. um, what happens is people tend to trade one fundamentalism for
Yes.
another.
Yeah, because they
What
think the
they
category
have
is important. They just need to,
yes,
they just don't like what they have in that category. Yes.
they have shifted what they believe, but they have not shifted how they believe.
How they
They have
believe.
shifted, the content, but the container is the same. And I think one of the biggest dangers we have, I think there are absolutely dangerous beliefs in terms of content. Like, those who don't believe in the vaccine, like, those who don't believe in climate change, like, there's things that are, like, the content of the beliefs are absolutely dangerous. But what is also dangerous is the way people believe at times.
Yeah.
And this type of attitude, this fundamentalist attitude that, if you don't agree with me, you are, condemned in some way. That's a really dangerous attitude in for us to continue to be human with each other.
That's right.
and
Because it's
uh,
not
and
only
s-
the way you believe that thing, like you say, the attitude, but how you, one of the ways you know you're fundamentalist, that fundamentalism is snuck in, is how you treat someone else who doesn't hold
yeah,
to the belief that you hold. Like the test of is, it's not like your passion for it or how important you think it. Like there's things that I feel like are core to who I am about what I believe about the world. So I
yeah,
don't think that yet makes me a fundamentalist. What will is when I meet someone who disagrees with that thing that I hold so dearly, then how I view them. When they
yes,
now have become an enemy, when they now have become someone that I have to move against or away from, when now there's conflict and power that's going to now need to be availed in a particular way, that's when you know you're into something that's not just, this seems to make all the sense in the world to me and I hold it very deeply. Is what do you do when you when
yes,
those ideas are challenged? And
yes.
um, you're right. You get that you get that in religion. Good Lord, you get it in politics. You get it in sports. You get it in
Ah!
coffee shops. I was thinking about how
So listen, you
when you
mentioned,
were
yeah,
describing fundamentalism, I'm like, like in the slow
Starbucks.
coffee movement, like
Oh,
is the
yeah,
person that owns their own independent coffee shop where they source all the ingredients and they hand grind and they slow pour. When someone's like, "Oh yeah, I got a favorite coffee shop too. It's the Caribou around the corner, or Starbucks or Pete's." They're like, "Oh yeah, no, that's not what we like."
yeah,
They're not all that,
yes,
but you've been in places where you're like, wow, I think I just crossed a line here. I didn't mean to, like, I didn't
yeah,
know there was a difference. I thought this was just all coffee. No, it's not
yeah,
just all coffee. So it's
yeah.
not just all politics or it's not just all religion.
Yes.
It's an
Well,
approach to
the
the world.
sports thing is hilarious. It reminds me of a story that happened when we were in Ireland. Vanessa and I were, near the end of our trip. We were staying at this little Airbnb, this little bed and breakfast, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. It was called the Seacoast Lodge in Fanmore, Ireland. It was just this really uh, unbelievable setting out in the middle of nowhere. And there's this little kind of hole in the wall pub that's across the street that we head over to have dinner. It's really like the only thing around, and so we head over there to have dinner. And before settling in, and we walk in, and on the far wall, it's clear that people who have visited here from the United States have left and hung on the wall kind of memorabilia of their sports teams that they root for, and there's hats and things. And we walk in, and the first thing Vanessa sees is a terrible towel, which is the towel that fans of the Pittsburgh Steelers swing around over their
Oh,
heads during games. It's those yellow towels, and I, as a Cleveland Browns fan, um, live with a deep and abiding hatred for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and that goes deep in ways that I can't fully express. And
nor
Vanessa
should
said
you.
to me, her first thought when she walked in and saw the terrible towel hanging on the wall was, "Oh no, we're not going to be able to eat here." But luckily, amazingly, uh, about 6 inches above the terrible towel was a Cleveland Browns banner hanging, and I mean, like, it was one of those, like, everything is right in the world. I'm in a tiny Irish pub in the middle of nowhere, and there's my team represented. And so that fundamentalism, when you point out that it exists in sports, it
Yeah.
absolutely does. It's the one vestige that I have still in me, I guess, of it.
It's what the Irish would call the thin spaces, and you had stepped into the kingdom of God, where both the Steelers fans and the Browns fans are yet welcomed to
Yep. Can enjoy a Guinness
enjoy the.
together and have a pint of Guinness together, and
Uh, yeah, well, this is this is what we face. That's why I'm so glad that what we do in our work is both religion and politics, right? They have so much more in common. One of the reasons people get so uncomfortable about the work in shared space of religion and politics is because it hasn't always gone well, and because they're so similar, and because they're so similar, you get a multiplier effect. So if your religious commitments call you to live in a certain way, and you somehow see that your political commitments also lead you to live in that way, well, those two compound each other. They reinforce, and they're a multiplier. It's what's the math term that I'm looking for? They don't just times, they square.
they're exponential.
They're exponential. So that's one of the things that kind of freaks people out when they see these kinds of deeply held beliefs that become fueled and together. So we have to treat both of those with even more care and even more awareness. And that's one of the things that we try to do in the work that we do at Vote Common Good, is try to get people who care about their faith. For us, we're trying to specifically reach out to Christian people who have been hardwired into republicanism, and they want another option of at least available to them. And we very much want them to take that other option in this current political system, because it's time for such a thing. But to try to really mitigate some of the compounding effects of what can happen when you get in a self-referential feedback loop, where you start to hear the same refrains coming from your religion and from your politics and from your culture and from your entertainment, and all of a sudden you're in a world that you really can't see out of. I mean, it's one thing to not be able to see and recognize everyone else's life experience, but if you feel like you're only seeing your own, and that is so normative, uh, that's where danger sets in. And unfortunately, even though we live in this global age, we live in a country that's made of people from all over the planet, that we are very in a place where access to difference is, for many people, at every day availability. Most people still live inside of an ecosystem where they're hearing only the self-curated narratives, and boy, that's awfully hard. And one of the ways, and this is why I think Jesus' teachings are so important, that you're supposed to love God, of course. You're supposed to love your neighbor. We all know that. You're even to love yourself in the same way you would love the first two on the list. And you're to love your enemy the same way. So enemy, self, neighbor, and God should all be of prime concern for you. It's sort of and captures everything of, all, and just throw in all other living beings in there, and you got the whole package. But that you don't separate out the enemy from self. Like the way you undo fundamentalism is to treat enemy the same way you treat self, you treat neighbor, and you treat God. That's the call. That's not, hey, let's rally up our power base of our neighbors, ask the God of the universe to bless those, and put yourself in the middle of it to attack your enemy. That's pretty typical. The Jesus teaching actually is an alternative to that, which says there's another way and a different way to move.
And all of that, Doug, loops back to the conversation about Afghanistan and the heartbreaking situation in which, we as the quote unquote Christian nation didn't live out these values and how we engaged in Afghanistan, and now look at the mess we've made as a result of it.
Yeah, it's in the Christian sense, as a somebody who's into non-militarization because of my Christian teaching. Some people who would very much bemoan, be saddened by, sickened by everything they can to stop what's referred to in military terms as friendly fire, meaning your weaponry was used to harm or kill someone who's on your side. It should only be used on the enemy, and then should only be used on the military expressions of your enemy. That in the Christian world, because your enemy isn't distinguishable from your neighbor or from yourself, all war is friendly fire casualties. Right? It's
Yeah, well
all
said.
it's all us. And we have to set all of that aside to behave in the way. And the same thing sort of happens in politics, or when you drive by, a group of protesters up the street from your house, or you're interacting with somebody on Facebook, or you're putting a chat in a podcast live stream. All of that is the same. That our the distinguishing between self, enemy, and neighbor and God is just that's a game that we're playing that would be better played by a different set of rules and practices, I think. Hey, there's a little sermon on a Tuesday.
Yeah, on the
Yeah, so
politics podcast. It's not even
on
the
the
faith podcast.
of all places. Well, I can't get a word in edgewise on that faith podcast. There's 4 pastors on that thing, and here there's only 2. At least I got a running shot at. I'm just playing. Hey, speaking of that, we'll be back tomorrow with the Faith Day with Stephanie Rose Spalding, with Laura Truax, with Dominique Gilliard, and me. So that happens on Wednesdays, and we'd love to have you aboard for that. Speaking of getting you on board, we'd love to bring you virtually or analogically down on the border with us. We're going to be traveling from San Diego to St. Augustine, Florida, 67 days along the southern border, taking it slow, taking it easy, just rolling along on bicycles from one side of the country to the other. I've been telling people about this ride, Rob, since January or so. And a number of people, including our bike mentor on this, runs a bike shop up the street here from where I live, and he's part of this. He said, "Hey, I was telling somebody the other day about your bike trip, and I told him that you were going to be going from San Antonio to Florida." I said, "Oh, well, we're going from San Diego." He's like, "Oh, you're going from San Diego? Like you're going across the whole country?" Somehow it gets in people's heads, just can't really. I thought it would be easier if you just say, "Oh, we're just doing the whole country." Like the reason we're not going to do only the U.S.-Mexico border is because that might get confusing. Just like, no, we're going coast to coast, ocean to ocean, or San Diego to St. Augustine, from saint to saint, to meet all the saints along the way. Like I just thought that would be an easier way to. No, people just can't really wrap their heads around the fact we're going to go across the entire country, and we're only doing it from west to east. So we're not doing like upper northeast down to southwest, or we're not doing cross cuts or anything. Just a little straight shot, 3,600 miles on bikes. Love to have you with us live, virtually, or just in your hearts, and even more in your bank account. So stick with us in the next couple of days. We're going to invite people to make donations per mile for this work we're doing, because we're telling the stories of life and how it's impacted by our border practices and immigration policies. And we think that's a story that should be shared with the kind of people that we want to engage in the common good in their politics. So that's what we're up to. Is that good for the day, Rob? You politicked out on the podcast?
Oh, absolutely! It's good to be back, and we're, as you said, in the dog days of summer, but this is when we when we plant the seeds that will bear fruit, come November of 2022.
Well, good to have you back. And Dan, thanks for the good support today. Those working on the Common Good podcast, Dan, Rob, and Doug today. But thanks to Robert and Jim and Mike and Carolyn and Jennifer and Tom and Donna and Marilyn and all the rest. Donald, for your participation on the live chat today. And for the rest of you, David, did I miss anybody else?
I think David was we didn't want to leave David out.
No. Thank you, David, especially to you. And we will talk to you all tomorrow.